Now that we have returned from these breakout rooms, everybody must stay on mute, but that doesn't mean you can't interact. Our chat box is open, and I will be following the chat box throughout the conversation. So whenever a question occurs to you, please put it in the chat box, and I will share the questions that come in with Abby and with Rabbi Lorge at the end. So Abby, Rabbi Lorge, take it away.
Okay. Ari, can I call you Ari?
Yes, please do.
Okay. you know that I have total respect for your title.
Yes.
I also just want to give a shout out before I start with the questions to Rabbi Sarah Berman, who has been an incredible steward through this. Not only incredibly organized, and I'm very type A, and she out type A's me, but just really offering a lot of wisdom herself as we take this journey and prepare for each one of these. So thank you, Sarah. So Ari, I guess I want to put you on the spot first with the questions we had to answer in our rooms. Can we just start with the question itself of the evening and of the piece? What was your first response to even the frame? What does God think about us? What is God's opinion?
My first response was, I'm so glad somebody finally asked me that, because I've known for so long. No, my first response is it's a presumptuous question to ask a human being. But luckily I have some good tradition to lean on here. And I think my starting place for it is one that really kind of roots itself in text, so I feel pretty grounded in it, which is a sense that I think God really believes in us, and that God is tremendously hopeful and sees in humanity all the potential for an ethical partner. And I think that's very much rooted in a sense of my theology and my sense of God.
Can you tell me a little bit what you mean by ethical partner?
Yeah. So, and here I think in Rabbi Timoner's response, she talks, in some detail about some of this coming from our creation story. And I think that's a good starting place for me too, in the sense that people who often look at humanity and say, well, we're the source of everything wrong in the world. Well, they're not wrong. We do make our own problems, right? And you could ask, well, God didn't need to create the world. God certainly, after creating the world, didn't need to make humans. But God did. And so what was the purpose there? There's some even wonderful rabbinic texts that imagine the angels being like, God, I don't know that you really know what you're doing here. These human things, they're going to be just the worst. I don't think you want to go down this road. You probably haven't really thought this one through. They're going to be pretty bad. But God goes ahead and does it. And one of the reasons in the Torah is it says that God is lonely. And in response to God's loneliness, God creates the world and then creates humanity. And when God gives human beings the commandment that they should rule over and master creation, God gives us some tremendous power. And that power is partially also this sense that, we are, if we're going to be mastering and ruling over the world, when we have freedom and we have free will, we can definitely steer things in the wrong direction. But through, I think, our religious tradition and through this vision of what God sets out for us in terms of what the world is supposed to be like, we are meant to help bring that to fruition and to realize that. And that God really needs us to be sort of this creative, active partner. And God is hoping that in the end we are ethical about it and that we're able to use this power for the good and not for the bad.
So when we talk about God's opinion, is there a bit of a sense of like how we're doing so far collectively? Livia Thompson put a great question in of, are we talking about God's opinion of us each individually as you see it, or collectively? Kind of, let's talk about the Jewish people, or maybe not the Jewish people, but that's our lens. I mean, when I was approaching this, I was kind of thinking more personally than collectively. But it kind of feels like those are two different questions. I mean, they're clearly two different questions, but how are you approaching this more about God's opinion of each one of us, or that we are thinking about what God thinks of Abby's behavior over the past year, my choices,
Right.
whether I've written in the Book of Life, or this idea of, as Phyllis Friedman was saying in our breakout group, like what we've done to the environment, like our collective impact on climate change.
I mean, I think Judaism suggests these things happen on both levels. I think we have to pay attention both to what we're doing as a collective, and I think it's broader. I mean, I think one of the beautiful aspects of our tradition is that it imagines us in a relationship with God through a covenant, but that covenant isn't restricted to Jews. There's a covenant made with all of humanity. There's a covenant made with Jews. There's a covenant made, I think, with each of us individually in God. And that relationship also is the same language we use in our tradition for a marriage, right? And that relationship is an intimate one. So I think, I think that it does have to exist on all of those different levels. It matters, I think, what I do as an individual, but it also matters how I key into the collective, because the way we act as a community is a reflection on me. And I think, that is seen in our High Holiday liturgy also, in the way that we don't just ask for forgiveness for ourselves and our individual sins, but we also count ourselves amongst the community. All of our, chest beating is done in the communal voice. We have sinned in these ways. So I think it's important to think of it in both ways, but I reel a little bit at the idea of this sort of judgment taker, this, God is sort of record keeper, and divine punishment and things like that, which I know is a topic that you address with another rabbi in a different setting. But to me, that's not really the point. Does God think I'm good or bad? That's not the framework I particularly find helpful for me. I think God has laid out a vision for the way that we're supposed to treat one another, and the way the world is supposed to function, and the way society at its best can function. And then our task is to realize that. And we need to do some reflection on how are we doing, right? How am I doing as an individual? How are we doing as a synagogue community? How is the city doing? How is the state doing? But the fact, fundamentally, at the end of the day, God believes we can be that aspirational good. So I think it was Abraham Joshua Heschel says we kind of become what we think of ourselves. And I would amend that here to say I think we also, what does it mean to me as an individual to know that God is actually a part, that God believes in me, right? That not just that, I can muster the strength to believe in myself, that I can maybe do this, these acts that I think are challenging, that I can overcome my base instincts, but to know that actually there is a divine entity that somehow is bolstering my sense of my own goodness, that can see goodness in me that even I maybe can't muster in this moment. And in that, I think we find tremendous reservoirs of strength, potentially, especially as we approach the high holidays and are meant to be reflecting on where did we miss the mark.
So because you put us right where we need to be in this time of Elul, in the run up to the high holidays, I just want to focus on, you said so many things I want to pursue, but particularly this idea of what the stakes are. When we pound our chests and recite these al-Chaitz and the Vidui and have a sense like why this matters. Yes, God, I want to get to God believing in our goodness and our capacity to kind of come back to our best selves, but we're also looking at our own ugliness right now, and we are looking at our own missteps in a way that's supposed to be, I think, pretty naked and pretty unsparing. So how would you advise us to do the work without completely self-flagellating? Like, how do we make it matter? God's opinion, doesn't it? I know we don't want to say that God is a judge. Like, I don't hear a lot of Reformed Jews believing that God is literally choosing who is going to get another year or not. But if we don't have the stakes be high enough to know, like, why should we do this work? Why should we stand there? What is partly the driver here in terms of God's opinion? Does that make sense?
I think that makes sense. Yeah.
The urgency.
Well, I mean, I think the urgency. The urgency can come from a lot of different places, but in terms of our sense of our relationship to God and where this comes in, I think we tend to think about Heschel a lot and talk about his sense of radical amazement, and we find God in radical amazement and sort of the wonder of nature. But a lot of Heschel also talks about this religious mindset as being one of embarrassment. And what he means by that is that a religious person really can't stare out at the world and say, I'm doing great. I'm doing wonderful. I'm a good person and everything's going well. That to look through the world through a religious mindset is to see the dissonance between what God had laid out as a good world and a vision of a redemption that God lays out before us in a lot of our tradition, and to see the disparity and to be embarrassed by the incredible dissonance there. And that embarrassment is meant to not be defeating, but to be motivating so that we can use that sense of shame and that sense of embarrassment and to try to better the world around us, and in doing so, better ourselves. And so I think some of this is a matter of what does God think of us as a way to put on the lenses of religious mindset to be able to look at the world and say, all right, so maybe I didn't cause that problem, or I don't think of myself as responsible for this issue. But God, has given us a glimpse of a better world, and it looks like this. And so therefore, maybe I didn't cause that problem, but I am responsible to making that different. Martin Buber says that, we're constantly in a dialogue with God, and the way that we are part of that dialogue is through our lives. That's the way we have this interchange with God. And that fundamentally speaks to me in the sense of I have a choice in front of me, or I have an action that I can take, and I'm either through that action and that choice realizing the divine in that moment, or subverting it. And that's a pretty stark choice.
Can you say, if you can be honest, are you thinking that way in your daily life? Do you feel like I can go right or left here, and one is more towards this idea of what my role is, and one is not? How conscious are you?
I think the struggle is to try to maintain that mindset on a daily level, and it's an impossible task, right? And that's why we have, that's the other piece is that, Heschel says, that's why we pray twice a day for forgiveness, right? That's part of the religious mindset, is knowing that we're going to miss the mark a bunch. For me, the thing that, from growing up, I don't remember this, but it's come down to me in the family lore, is that when my grandfather, who was a rabbi, would be advising folks, often the question he asked is, what's the loving thing to do? That's a piece of family wisdom that I've come back to a lot in hard crossroad conversations, because I do fundamentally believe the way we answer that question does potentially help manifest divine and godliness around us.
Rachel is asking, I think, something that's important to just own here, which is that I think a lot of the way I'm phrasing the questions are sort of making God anthropomorphic. And that's a stumbling block for a lot of people. And if you don't see God that way, how do you see God's opinion? How do we look at whether it's God's judgment or God's evaluation or God's belief in us? What's the language you would suggest if we don't kind of think that God's a being?
Yeah, it's tough. The image thing is really difficult. We are very, very strict about saying no images, and then our tradition uses them all over the place. Partially because we're humans and we're limited, and so finding images that resonate for us can be deeply helpful. The rabbis use a lot about talking about God's face, and again, right? I don't think God has a face. I don't have an image that I think I can sort of say this is like the resonant image for us. But I do think that reticence to go into an anthropomorphic place and to think of God as a man with a beard is a good one to reject, because that is, I think, deeply unhelpful and has caused a lot of harm. I worry about theological malpractice in those kinds of ways. But I do think there's still, we still have a received tradition that has a clear message about the world and the way it's supposed to look. And without imagining that God is somehow in the shape of a human being, we can still key into the image that God has given us for the world and allow ourselves to say, there is a source of strength and goodness and love in the world that is bigger than me and connects me to every other living thing. And I am either tapping into those, to that source, and I am manifesting that in the world, or I am not. And then, it's not an old man with a book. It's more of a sense of what a redeemed, whole, just, and equitable world looks like. And me asking myself, in this moment, am I manifesting that? Am I able to be the hands that God doesn't have? Or am I able to be, am I able to take right? We don't believe God is anthropomorphized. So can I use my body, right, which is very much real, to do that work? Because I don't think God has a body to do it. That maybe is a way that can be helpful to think about it.
I think that's beautiful and completely resonates. I guess I want to now kind of turn a little bit more starkly to the individual, and the idea that one of the things that Rabbi Timoner talks about, she uses language about God receiving us. God is always ready to receive us. And I kind of was jarred by that. It felt like Christian language to me. And she really pushed back and said there are so many things that we've allowed to kind of be in a way owned by Christianity that, yes, Christians have talked about and have great theology about, but we started it. But just that idea of God being willing to receive us, even if you don't believe in an anthropomorphic God, that kind of got me choked up, that whatever missteps I've made, wherever I have really genuinely hurt someone or screwed up, there's a sense of that our tradition takes us back. And particularly going into this holiday. Can you address that?
Yeah, that is so fundamentally Jewish. We don't have to, pin that on, Christianity at all. I'm gonna go into an anthropomorphic image again, because that's okay. It's the rabbinic and biblical image, and it's flawed. But I think it speaks to this, maybe where Rabbi Timoner is pulling from this idea, although it's all over the tradition. But one of the places we can see it is throughout our texts. I mentioned God is spoken about as having a face, and that face, we're constantly asking for that face to be turned towards us. And when God's face is turned away from us, that's bad, and when God's face is turned towards us, that's good. It's one of the sections of the priestly blessing that we always are invoking over new babies on our bima before we lift them up, or wedding couples under the chuppah, right? One of the blessings we ask is for God to turn God's face to this couple or this individual or this baby. It's also in the psalm that we recite throughout this month of Elul. We ask God not to turn away from us and for God's face not to be hidden from us, right? Because that'd be very bad. But I think that speaks to this idea of this relationship that we have, and I would say, I think, and this is another flip that I think is helpful to think about. I don't think God turns God's face away from us. I think we're probably more often than not the ones who are turning ourselves away. I think God is probably always staring at us, waiting for us to return, or hoping that we'll turn our face back. But more often than not, we're the ones who are turning away. So I kind of flip this biblical idea a bit. It's not novel. I didn't invent it, right? I think this is also Heschel's flip of, instead of saying man in search of God, Heschel talks about God in search of, God in search of man, right? God is always there, facing us, waiting for us, and we're the ones who need to respond.
So just one of the things that you started with Genesis and with this line that she parses with the two yuds, which I don't want to get deep into, but
You don't want to talk grammar?
I think we're going to lose the audience.
Yeah.
You might lose me, but just the idea that what is in that punctuation is these two inclinations that we have to evil and good. How do you help us kind of, it sounds kind of stark, almost like pediatric, like a lesson you would give a child, like, there's a good side and there's a bad side. So go with the good side. But what is challenging, I think, is that she talks about, and you and I talked in our preparatory call, that some of the evil, quote, evil inclination is necessary. That it's not, that Judaism actually asks us for both and wants us to hold both in balance. Can you address, like, what's that about?
Yeah, I mean, in its simplest terms, it sounds like Star Wars, and you're either like part of the, you're either a Jedi on the dark, you're either a Jedi on the light side, or you're a Sith Lord on the dark side, and that's the constant conflict that Luke would say. He's got the conflict, and that's drawing from a
I just want to say, when you talk about Sondheim, then I'm with you. But when you
Star Wars, not so much.
No, but
Okay.
maybe the rest of the gang is just right with you in your metaphors.
I would say, unfortunately, Sondheim is not that simplistic. So I think Sondheim's probably more squarely in this rabbinic camp we'll talk about in a second. But we have these two inclinations, Judaism says, an inclination for good and an inclination for wickedness or evil or badness, however you want to translate it. And those two things are constantly doing battle within every human soul. And there's nothing, other religions might take that tension and bring it outside of the human and say there's the devil and there's God, right? So you have the duality not only at play within you, but also out in the world. We don't have that because we have one God. So all of that tension becomes part of the arena within the human soul that gets played out, right? We are not tempted by some devil. This is just within us. But it's not that simplistic when you really dive into Judaism. Even the rabbis writing in their early periods talk about how both are really necessary drives, and Rabbi Timoner talks about this, that you really wouldn't be a human only, if you were made entirely only up of the good inclination. That there are aspects of things that we might categorize as part of the Yetzer Hara, part of this evil inclination, that are necessary and needed. And that, in fact, most of our creative drives probably come out of the Yetzer Hara, whether it's, wanting to, seeing somebody do something excellent and wanting to, compete, right? Like competition at its base level, is a Yetzer Hara kind of feeling, right? And yet, think of all the tremendous good that has come out of the competitive drive within human beings, right? Even something as base as procreation is really part of the Yetzer Hara, but it has potential to be sanctified. And that's really, I think, a piece of this that's important, is that within Judaism, anything, like, there's nothing really that's profane or wicked. Anything can be sanctified, and being in sanctifying it, it becomes part of a process that can lead us towards the good. Right. So.
And where might the good be out of balance? Where can you have too much good?
Oh, well, so yeah, it's similar, right? Yeah, our good drives are not always all good. We could probably brainstorm a lot of examples, but if you think of people who, through a desire to do philanthropy, end up doing paternalistic work, right, and actually maybe doing damage to the people they're trying to help, that's a way that our Yetzer HaTov can actually be destructive. There's lots of different examples of ways that we might do that.
All right, can you just define, Betty Robbins very correctly just said we hadn't really defined those terms in Hebrew. Can you do that?
Yeah, so again, the Yetzer HaTov is the good inclination, and the Yetzer Hara is the evil inclination or the wicked inclination. And those are two twin aspects of urges that are within us that are constantly battling one over the other. But the point is that they're not just supposed to be in balance with one another. It's not enough to try to find a balance between your good and your evil. your evil urge isn't all that evil. It's necessary. It's needed. And the point is to try to find balance within it also, so that things that could turn evil, right? The way that love can turn to lust, right? It's part of our Yetzer Hara. Well, we want it to be love and not lust. And our Yetzer Hara.
I didn't know that lust was such a bad thing, but that's for another day.
Well, if you channel lust in the right way, maybe it's not such a bad thing, I guess, right? It's all about this this sense of anything can be sanctified. And so, we shouldn't. I wish we had a better word for evil, but it's Yetzer Hara.
And is that in Torah, Talmud? Where are those definitions?
You see this played out mostly in the rabbinic literature, but I would defer to Rabbi Berman to correct me.
Okay, Rabbi Berman, do you want to weigh in on that?
Absolutely not. I also believe it to be a rabbinic tradition based on Torah text, but so they would say it's drawn from Torah, but I think that they are our earliest citations there.
So I want to go to questions, and thank you, Sarah. This is like our lifeline, like we called our, is that what it is?
Phone to Rabbi.
A phone to Rabbi. I want to go to questions, but I want to just turn to the fact that you've become a father recently of the most adorable child who is clearly only has Yetzer Tov, like goodness in that little boy. But as you think about this idea of what God thinks of us, I know when I became a parent that you sort of suddenly feel responsible for shaping a person's kind of trajectory. And goodness, evil, it's not so much those words you're thinking about, but that you're kind of responsible for, that sense of who this person's going to be, the road you're setting them on. So just in terms of like, if you can, if it's not too personal, I mean, it is personal, but if you're comfortable, just talking a little bit about if you feel like God is watching, I guess, as you parent this new life.
Gosh, I don't know that I don't know for me, right? And here it's us getting tripped up on images that don't work for us. I don't feel a lot like God is watching me. I feel like I'm noticing whether or not I'm acting godly or not, right? That I have maybe this outside sense of what's right and wrong, and I know when I've missed the mark, and when I need to realize that I'm turning away, right? Or that I let one of my urges get out of line and caused a response in me that I'm not proud of, right? But and so but putting the image aside, I think. I feel, as a new parent that I can so clearly picture moments when my father had these kinds of conversations with me and really shaped a sense of my belief system, my sense of my connection to Judaism, helped me wrestle through my sense of, how does God work? What are these difficult questions? Why am I here? What's my purpose? And really feeling like I had such a rich place and home to be able to have the vocabulary to have those conversations with him, and wanting so much to be able to pass that forward to him as he grows up. And I think for me, some of the most incredible moments have been moments that aren't necessarily about, because he's so not quite aware yet of those things. But
you're not teaching him Talmud yet?
Not yet. He's got a little bit of time, and he'll need a better teacher than me. But when I hold him and we light candles on Friday night and we're watching the stream right now, like that is pretty much amazing. And that's so far those moments that have really made me feel like I'm tapping into a very long piece of my family history and channeling something sacred and more ancient than me, and continuing something, right? And I think that for me is a big piece of it, is we have this vision about what the world's supposed to be, and we've been at it for generations. And I don't know what I'll pass down to him, but I hope that I can pass down that vision of what the world is meant to look like. And at least, I think we all hope that we move the needle a little bit closer towards that vision. but at least giving him the vision will give him something to work towards and hopefully connect him to something that's greater than himself, which is, I think, God.
Beautiful. I wish you could show a picture of him right now because there's God in that face. Sarah, let's go to questions. I'm going to let you pose them, but I might follow up. Right? We have, I think,
Yeah,
15 minutes.
great. So the first three questions are all related to each other. So I'll let you kind of tackle them as a group. And they actually come from 4 different people.
3 questions from 4 people?
Absolutely. 2 answers, basically the same question. Yep. It's such a good question. It came from multiple sources. Ellen asks, because we don't get feedback from God as to how God thinks we are doing, does the concept that God believes in us give us the strength to believe in ourselves and reinforce our belief that we are capable of being our best selves? And then Harriet and Phyllis Friedman, both asked, are we talking about conscience when we talk about the God inside or this presence of God? And Amy Goldberger, hers is more a statement, but I think it's in this family. She agrees that God is, what God thinks of us is really about what we think of ourselves, not what God thinks of me. This is Amy writing. It's what I think of myself based on the ethics that exist in the world, that I'm pounding myself for me. So if you could tackle that sense of external God versus internal God, particularly as God plays out in conscience.
Yeah, I think there's certainly an aspect to conscience that is certainly a barometer, right? It could be like a very useful tool to us here, but I think we don't have, the problem with that is that it's a relatively subjective marker, and here I think is where a religious tradition is very helpful, right? No matter what I think, I have these texts that I have to deal with and a whole slew of commentaries related to those texts. So if I'm reading this prophetic voice that tells me that I actually do have to care about the people who don't have homes and who are hungry, and I'm actually meant to help feed them, no matter what my conscience tells me, I also have this faith tradition that actually is very explicitly telling me what this image of the world is meant to look like, where everybody has a shelter and everybody has a vine and a fig tree that's been growing long enough to be able to produce fruit, which means I've been living on that land for a good amount of time, which also means I can feed myself and nobody can make me afraid, which means I don't have to worry about so like there's this I think it's more than just a conscience that's inside of us. I'm hoping that at our best, when we are attuned to that, it is totally in alignment with what God would call us to do. But we also have a 1,000-year-old faith tradition that very clearly and explicitly tells us, in some cases, where we're hitting and where we're missing the mark. Talking about any number of things, both the way we deal with one another and the way we deal with the world around us, and that is an important tool that's more than a subjective marker within ourselves. And the other thing I should have said earlier is the question of we were talking about tshuva and repentance and our approach to the holidays, and I failed to mention that while I do think God is always there waiting to receive us, there is an element to tshuva and repentance and Elul and the high holidays which God may be, when we're told, ready to forgive us as long as we do as long as we repent. But we also, when we hurt one another, there's actually a higher benchmark there, which is God won't forgive us until we seek forgiveness from one another. Heading into the high holidays, it would be wrong of me to exclude that very important point, which is, in fact, there's actually a higher bar around our forgiveness when we've hurt one another and done harm to another human being or to another person.
Abby, any follow-up?
Well, I just love what you just said, because I think sometimes, maybe I'm just speaking for myself and you're hearing my Jewish neurosis, but there's a sense of it's almost easier to have the reckoning with God than it is with each other. And you're reminding us that that's the harder, that's the work that's really asked of us, is to kind of be courageous enough. We can't do it face to face this year.
Right.
But you know, when I think about our inclinations, when I think about whether God is a being or not, that I do feel somewhat watched. I think that's where I'm sometimes particularly failing, is the courage to face someone who you know with whom you misstepped.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most radically difficult thing that our tradition asks us to do, which is to actually face people we've wronged and ask for forgiveness. That is brutally difficult, but
Worth it.
but worth it, extremely worthwhile. And we have to be ready for whatever the response might be, right? We don't know what we're going to expect in that moment. But I do think...
You know what, I actually want to ask you, though, and it just occurred to me that, you know, where Rachel Timorner was saying God will always take you back, I don't know that our friends always do.
Well,
they're not as forgiving. They're not like necessarily ready to receive us. Some people really, I mean, I'm joking, but some people can't get past things.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, there are, you know, beyond the everyday slights and difficulties we might have interpersonally, you know, whether there are acts that are unforgivable is another, you know, deeply theological question, but ultimately comes down not to God, but to the way we interact with one another. I think it maybe is easier in the sense that, right, I do think that Rabbi Timon is 100% correct that God is always ready to receive us. And you're right to point out, we're not always ready to receive one another. And that makes the forgiveness asking much more difficult. But
Sarah, was there something else?
Yeah. So the next question is also a pair of questions. Paula Hunker asks, if God is in each one of us and we are all a unique being with divine creation or from divine creation, can we have a relationship with God apart from having a relationship with each other? And Carol Martin also wrote and observed that maybe it's our uniqueness manifesting itself in unique relationships with one another and with God, this sense, Ari, that you were starting to dive into. But that question that Paula asked, can we have a relationship with God that is separate from our relationships with one another? That certainly speaks to my own theology. I'm curious how it fits into your conception.
No, I don't think we can. That's the quick answer. I think a different.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Oh yeah, I don't think we can have a relationship with God that doesn't include our relationships with people. But I think for me that comes to right, another theological belief or a God belief of mine, which is that the way that we interact with other people is one of the main ways that we actually are interacting with God. This sense that, and this is again a kind of a Martin Buber idea for those of you who might be interested in some really tough, dense reading, which I'm not right now. So, but for those of you who are, but his sense that the way that we interact with one another is one of the ways that we can find God or actually make God real in the world. And I think that's, you know, again, one of the more important ways for us to approach also this time when we're trying to reflect on our relationships with one another and the choices that we've made this year. This sense that it's actually maybe more important, not so much the work we're doing in synagogue, and I might really get in trouble for saying that, but the work that we're doing in our homes or out on the street or in our, well, not in our offices maybe right now, but over a Zoom conference. The everyday life is actually the life that's meant to be sanctified, and we bring God into those moments through our relationships with one another and the way we treat one another. And that's, you know, if we have, you know, it's a false choice, but if you're asking me, should I come to Friday night services to listen to the music and to say the prayers, or should I try to live out God in my home and out on the street? It's a relatively easy answer for me. We need you on the street, right? We need you out in the world. And that piety for piety's sake is pretty shallow.
I love that. But Sarah, I want to go to the next because we're running out of time.
So do we have time for one more question or two more questions? Because that will...
I think if you can give two efficiently, and I know Ari can be can be, I mean, I'm taking up time, so please ask.
Let's go for two.
Right, we'll do two. The first one is, many people are asking around this, but it is encapsulated best in this question. How do we prepare to receive one another in forgiveness when there has been difficulty?
Well, I mean, I think difficulty is probably the only place where we are looking to receive each other in for forgiveness. So I don't know that there's an easy place. The work of Elul is not only about us having to figure out where we've missed the mark and have to correct, but also in doing so and in kind of cataloging the year, my guess is there are probably things that are still with us that are ways that we've been hurt, and whether or not we're ready to forgive is not an easy, clear, simple outline for how to do that. But at least thinking about what would we be doing if somebody actually was to come before us and ask for forgiveness, right? It's like anything else. When you're surprised in the moment is not often where I do my best work, or I'm not always the proudest of my responses when I'm caught off guard and searching for a response. And so, as we're reflecting on the year and trying to take stock, thinking about the hurts that are still with us, that we might, there's no guarantee anybody's going to come before us, right? That's there's no guarantee about that. But if somebody was, would we be ready to forgive? And if not, why not? Our tradition tells us that if somebody comes to us 3 times asking for forgiveness, and then we still aren't able to forgive them, God will eventually forgive them after those 3, if they're real and sincere attempts. I think it's instructive that it doesn't say to us, then you must forgive them. There may actually be harm done to us in this world that we are not capable of forgiving. And I think that's important.
All right. It may be a mistake, but I think I saved the hardest question, maybe the hardest question, for last. Ed Skloot asks, you use scripture to ground your perspective. How have you personally felt or experienced this perspective on God?
This idea that I talked about with Heschel's Embarrassment has been something that's been sitting with me quite a bit the last few months, years. And I think, with such a sometimes very clear vision of what the world is supposed to be, and such a brutally clear sense of what it is, that embarrassment has been has been a very full part of my sort of reaction to the world and the world events that I see unfolding around me. I am not so arrogant to think that I can control most of it or much of it, but I do want to be able to say I'm doing my best for my area or my small neck of the world, and I often think that I'm probably failing at that, but I think that's also what Heschel is suggesting is the probably proper religious mindset, which is why we ask for forgiveness not just on Yom Kippur but twice a day. Now, I don't think that's meant to be defeating. I really think that's meant to be motivating. It's not supposed to put me in a place where I don't want to get out of bed in the morning because I am so ashamed of what the world is. It's meant to, right, because I believe God is a partisan with me in this work. It's meant to motivate me to do what I can. And I think my sense of Elul, most this year, maybe more than ever, is feeling like maybe I really haven't done enough to create the kind of change I want to see in the world, and feeling like I need to do some tshuva for that. And so that's a little bit of my personal reckoning this year.
I just want to say just a moderator's prerogative, that I think you're doing more than your share. And I speak for pretty much everyone on this Zoom call when I say that. But one of the things I'm left with as we finish is that it's really a charge from you to not, we're not going to be sitting in synagogue this year when we pound our chests, but we are hopefully going to be connected virtually. But that's really not enough. And I feel like I'm not just saying that in the sort of, convenient putting a button on this, but that you're reminding me, as the prophets say, that it's not our fasts, it's not our sacrifices, it's not our incense and our fire, it's what are we doing for the person in trouble. And there's a lot of people in trouble right now. So I just thank you for kind of refocusing us on the work of Elul. It's not just internal, it's our internal measure of what we're doing externally for everyone out there who's suffering right now. So Sarah, on that note, positivity and a sense of what's possible.
No better way to end things. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you all for being here. I think next up is Rabbi Angela Buchdahl. Am I right? Next week.
You are right.
But I miss you all. I really do. And it means a lot that you are on. And Ari, what a pleasure, Rabbi Lorge, to get this chance to talk to you.
No, this was really a tremendous opportunity and so much fun to be able to have these conversations we don't often have, which is a surprising thing for a rabbi to say, but it's true. And I can't wait to keep tuning in.
You're getting a lot of thanks in the chat box, so just for your own ego, you should read them later.
I'll put
Bye,
that
everybody.
in a good pocket. All right. Thank you all so much.